Welcome to class, students. Welcome. Today we'll be looking at a very important topic titled The Methodology of Political Philosophy. The Methodology of Political Philosophy. Introduction. The methodological dimension of political philosophy constitutes a fundamental and often contentious area of inquiry that addresses the essential epistemological questions underlying all political theorizing. How can we acquire a reliable knowledge about political matters? What constitutes adequate justification for political claims? And through what processes should we evaluate and critique competing political arguments? So these are political methodology. They address question like what constitutes adequate justification for political claims, and through what processes should we evaluate and critique competing political arguments. This methodological consideration become particularly crucial with political philosophers attempt to resolve substantial theoretical disagreements such as debate over optimal government structure, the proper scope for individual rights, the legitimacy of political authority, or the requirement of social justice. The normative challenge and its implication. Central to methodological discussion in political is the recognition that the discipline is fundamentally evaluative or normative in character, concerned primarily with determining which values, moral principles, and institutional arrangements and social practices are genuinely desirable or morally required rather than merely describing existing political phenomena. This normative orientation distinguishes political philosophy from purely empirical political science that creates distinctive methodological challenges that have profound implications for the discipline's claims to knowledge and rational argumentation. The evaluative nature of political philosophy generates what many scholars recognize as fundamental epistemological problems. Normative disagreements appear to be significantly more difficult to resolve, definitely definitely than disagreements about empirical facts, while disputes about factual matters can typically be settled through systematic observation, controlled experimentation, statistical analysis, and other forms of empirical investigation that provide intersubjectively accessible evidence. Normative disputes about what ought to be the case seems to resist similar resolution through appeal to shared evidential standard. This methodological asymmetry between empirical and normative inquiry creates persistent challenges for political philosophers seeking to develop compelling arguments for their preferred theoretical position. Even when philosophy even when philosophers present sophisticated and internally coherent arguments supporting particular normative conclusion, these arguments frequently fail to generate widespread agreement among qualified experts, suggesting that either the arguments themselves are inadequate or that the nature of normative inquiry makes consensual resolution inherently difficult or impossible. The subjectivity problem and its philosophical implication. One influential interpretation of this persistent disagreement suggests that they reveal a fundamental limitation in political philosophy aspiration to objective knowledge. According to skeptical view, the intractable nature of normative disputes indicates that major portion of political philosophy inquiry may primarily express a subjective preference, cultural biases, or ideological commitment rather than discovering objective truths about political morality or institutional design that possess universal rational authority. This subject this subjectivist interpretation challenges the traditional conception of political philosophy as a rational discipline capable of providing authoritative guidance for political action than an institutional reform. If political philosophical conclusion merely reflect the subjective views of their proponents rather than objective moral or political truth, then the discipline claims to provide rational foundation for political criticism and reform become highly questionable. However, this subjectivist interpretation faces significant political challenges from those who argue that the persistent nature of normative disagreement does not necessarily undermine the objectivity of normative inquiry. Alternative explanations of persistent disagreement include the inherent complexity of normative equation, the influence of non-rational factors on belief formation, the underdetermination of normative conclusion by available evidence, and the possibility that normative progress occurs gradually over extended historical period rather than through immediate consensual resolution of disputes. The methodological approach to political philosophy inquiry includes common sense and critical examination, particularism, foundationalism, reflective equilibrium. The common sense and critical examination. One widely employed methodological approach begins with common held belief, intuitive judgment, and established social practice. Subjecting the starting Subjecting the starting point of systematic critical examination designed to assess the rational validity and internal coherence. This methodological assumes that the ordinary moral and political institution, while not infallible, contain important insights that can serve as raw material for philosophical reflection and theoretical construction. The critical examination also involves the systematic consideration of arguments supporting and challenging common sense belief, exploring the rational foundation that might justify accepting or rejecting particular intuitive judgment. This process may reveal that some widely held beliefs rest on weak or questionable foundation, while others prove more robust when subjected to philosophical scrutiny. Finally, this methodology requires serious engagement with alternative viewpoints that challenge common sense assumptions, forcing philosophers to consider whether their initial starting point can withstand critical comparison with fundamentally different approaches to political questions. Particularism, bottom-up methodological approach. Particularist methodological represents a bottom-up approach to political philosophy inquiry that treats individual moral and political institutions about specific circumstances as a primary foundation for theoretical construction. Rather than beginning with abstract principles or general theories, particularists start with particular judgment about concrete cases, seeking to identify patterns and commonalities that can sympathize or systematize into broader theoretical framework This approach assumes that human beings possess reliable moral and political intuition about particular situations that provide more secure foundation for theoretical construction than abstract philosophical principles. Particularists argue that attempts to derive political conclusions from general principles often produce results that conflict with well-established particular judgment, suggesting that the principles themselves may be flawed or inadequately formulated. However, particularist approaches face significant challenges in moving up from particular judgment to a general theoretical conclusion. Critics argue that particular institutions may be inconsistent, culturally biased, or influenced by irrelevant factors, making them unreliable foundations for broader theoretical construction. Foundationalism, top-down methodological approach. Foundationalist methodology employs a top-down approach that begins with fundamental principles or basic values and attempts to construct comprehensive political theories through logical derivation from these foundational commitments. This approach assumes that reliable political knowledge requires theoretical foundation that can serve as ultimate justification for particular conclusion. Practical utilitarianism exemplifies foundationalist methodology by providing all the political evaluation in a single principle, the maximization of overall happiness or the well-being measured by the balance of pleasure over pain. From these fundamental principles, utilitarian theorists attempt to derive specific conclusions about government structures, individual rights, distributive justice, and other political questions through systematic application of utilitarian calculus. However, foundationalist methodology also faces significant challenges. Critics argue that foundationalist principles are often controversial and difficult to justify independently of the particular conclusion they generate, creating problems for circular reasoning. Additionally, the application of abstract principles to complex political situations may require controversial judgment about empirical facts. This relative importance of competing values and the appropriate scope for of theoretical the reflective equilibrium, that integrative methodological approach, is mostly developed by philosopher John Rawls, who represents an attempt to combine the insights of both particularist and foundationalist approach while avoiding their respective limitations. This methodology seeks to achieve coherent integration between the general principles and particular judgment through a process of mutual adjustment that takes both levels of moral and political reasoning seriously. The process begins with careful identification of considered judgments, particular moral and political judgments made under favorable conditions for reflection, free from obvious sources of bias or distortion. These judgments provide important constraints on acceptable theoretical conclusions, ruling out principles that would require abandoning too many well-established particular convictions. Simultaneously, the method involves formulation of general principles that can systemize, and explain the patterns underlying considered particular judgment. These principles provide theoretical unity and enable extension of moral and political reasoning to new cases that may not be covered by existing particular judgment. Method and approach. We also have universalism versus critical relativism. Fundamentalist approaches typically embrace universalist principles, maintain that core moral and political standards transcend cultural boundaries and apply uniformly across all society and historical epochs. Universalities contend that fundamental values governing political conduct remain constant regardless of cultural context. Cultural revitalists Cultural relativists challenge this cross-cultural perspective, asserting that moral and political norms emerge from and remain bound to a particular cultural setting. They argue that political principles reflect community-specific assumptions and therefore cannot function as a universal criteria for assessing different society or government systems. Thank you for listening.